There was a time when the world ran on a single rulebook. A time when Washington's voice could silence every other conversation, when one nation's word was treated as final and no one dared to question it. But that time has ended, and what we are witnessing now is the collapse of an old order that once felt unshakable. The old rules don't work anymore. They were built for a world that no longer exists, for an age when economies were weaker, options were fewer, and dependence on one superpower was the only way to survive. For decades, America dictated the rhythm of the game, not because they were always right, but because they controlled the levers: finance, trade, technology, even culture. If you stepped out of line, the punishment was immediate: sanctions, tariffs, financial blockades. If you wanted access to markets, capital, or global recognition, you had to play by their rules, and for a long time it worked. But like every system that clings to outdated methods, it eventually broke down under its own weight. Look at the world today. It's no longer a single-lane highway where one power decides the speed. It's a massive, chaotic intersection filled with rising nations, shifting alliances, and multiple centers of influence. The old sanctions-based control is like trying to stop modern traffic with a horse and buggy. Outdated, ineffective, almost laughable. Nations now have choices, and choice is the ultimate weapon against control. India doesn't need to beg for permission before buying oil. China doesn't need to wait for approval before building infrastructure. Brazil doesn't need a blessing before creating new partnerships. The game has moved forward, but America is still flipping through yesterday's playbook as if nothing has changed. That is why every time Washington tries to use those old tools, they look weaker, not stronger. The truth is, power isn't about who shouts the loudest anymore. It's about who adapts, who builds, who evolves. The nations rising now are not the ones clinging to the past. They're the ones who understand that the 21st century requires a new set of rules. They're not waiting for a superpower to hand them opportunities. They're creating their own. They're developing parallel systems for trade, finding alternatives to the dollar, setting up independent technology hubs, and creating partnerships that bypass the old structure. This is why America's threats don't carry the same fear they once did, because the monopoly is broken. Think about it. For decades, the idea of resisting Washington was unthinkable. Countries complied not because they wanted to, but because they had no escape route. Today, escape routes are everywhere. Russia offers energy at discounts. China builds roads and ports through massive projects. India develops its own digital backbone. The Middle East invests in new global partnerships. The Global South forms coalitions that speak with confidence. The stranglehold is gone, replaced by a web of alternatives that keeps expanding with each passing year. The more America tries to squeeze, the more nations innovate around the squeeze. What was once an unbreakable chain is now a loose thread unraveling in real time. And here lies the real lesson. Power isn't permanent when it refuses to evolve. America's greatest mistake was believing that the methods of the past would always guarantee obedience in the future. That sanctions would always frighten, that tariffs would always bend knees, that military presence would always demand respect. But respect today is earned differently. It is earned through resilience, through independence, through the courage to prioritize your people instead of someone else's demands. India proved this when it said no to Washington's orders. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply and clearly. And that single act echoed across the globe, because it revealed something powerful. The spell of old rules is broken, and the world is finally ready to play by new ones. The measure of true power is not in how quickly you say yes, but in how firmly you can say no. For decades, the world was trained to obey the commands of stronger nations, as if survival itself depended on compliance. When Washington spoke, nations nodded. When sanctions were threatened, governments surrendered. When demands were made, leaders justified their obedience as diplomacy. But real leadership has never been about blind obedience. It has always been about the courage to make decisions that protect your people, even if it means standing against the loudest voice in the room. Power belongs to the brave who say no, because that single word carries more weight than 1,000 speeches of submission. India understood this in a way that shook the foundations of global politics. When Washington demanded that New Delhi stop buying Russian oil, the old expectation was that India would bow its head, accept the pressure, and comply. That was the script everyone expected, because that's how the system had always worked. But India chose a different path. They didn't argue. They didn't waste energy on endless debates. They didn't lash out with anger or make dramatic threats. They simply said no, not for rebellion, not for ego, but for survival, for prosperity, for the well-being of over 1 billion people who depend on affordable energy. That no was an act of clarity, of conviction, of leadership, that placed the interests of the people above the approval of outsiders. The world watched closely. Western leaders expected panic, collapse, or retreat once the threats came. But India didn't flinch. They calculated. They understood the stakes. They weighed the costs and benefits. And when the decision was made, they stood by it with calm confidence. That is the essence of strength. Doing what is necessary, not what is popular in someone else's eyes. Saying no when it matters most is not defiance. It is discipline. It is the discipline to resist pressure, the discipline to hold firm, the discipline to protect sovereignty, even in the face of threats. What makes this act so powerful is that it redefined the meaning of loyalty and partnership on the world stage. For years, nations were told that loyalty meant obedience, that being a friend of America meant following orders without question. India shattered that illusion. They showed that true partnership is not servitude. True partnership is respect, and respect only comes when you stand on your own feet. Saying no was not betrayal, it was the ultimate expression of independence. And independence is what earns respect in a world tired of one-sided relationships. This is why India's no resonated far beyond oil or energy. It became a symbol, a reminder to every nation that submission is not the only path forward. It told smaller countries that even in the shadow of great powers there is room for choice, there is room for courage, there is room for sovereignty. That no became a rallying cry for dignity, proof that a nation doesn't have to trade its future for temporary approval. Leaders around the world saw it, and whether they admit it openly or not, it inspired them. Because power today doesn't belong to those who control the most weapons or the loudest media. It belongs to those who can look at pressure, at threats, at global disapproval, and still say we will do what is right for our people. That kind of resolve cannot be bought. It cannot be coerced. It cannot be broken by tariffs or sanctions. It is forged in the fire of self-belief, in the conviction that your duty is not to please outsiders but to protect your citizens. And when a country as vast, as complex, and as influential as India demonstrates that strength, it sends a message that the rest of the world cannot ignore. True power lies in the courage to say no. Independence is no longer just a principle. It is the strongest currency of power in the modern world. Once upon a time, money and military strength were enough to dominate. If you controlled the dollar, you controlled trade. If you had the largest army, you controlled politics. If you had the banks, the weapons, the ports, the satellites, you had the leverage to bend the nations into obedience. But the rules of the game have shifted, and the currency that matters most now is the ability to stand on your own feet. Independence is the shield that protects nations from foreign pressure, and it is the sword that allows them to cut new paths without waiting for approval. Those who master it will rise. Those who depend on permission will fall. India has understood this lesson better than most. When the pressure came to abandon Russian oil, the old world expected India to collapse under the weight of sanctions and threats. But India had already built something stronger than dependency. They had created options. They had created partnerships outside the dollar, payment systems outside American banks, new lines of trade that bypassed the old gates of power. This independence allowed them to make decisions on their own terms, not on terms dictated from overseas. And that is what shook the world, because independence means immunity from control. Think about how powerful this is. For decades, sanctions were the ultimate weapon. If America cut you off, your economy crumbled. If the dollar was denied, your trade froze. If access to markets was blocked, your people suffered. But now, the value of sanctions is collapsing because nations like India have designed alternatives. They can pay in rupees, rubles, yuan, or digital systems that don't pass through American banks. They can source energy from one supplier, technology from another, and financing from a third. This is independence in action. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving without chains. And this independence is not accidental. It is the result of years of careful strategy. India invested in its own digital economy, building the largest biometric ID system in the world, creating digital payment networks that reach hundreds of millions of citizens without relying on foreign tech giants. They developed their own space program, putting satellites in orbit and landing on the moon, proving they don't need to rent innovation, they can create it. They built pharmaceutical powerhouses that supplied vaccines to the world, not as a favor but as proof that they control their own health security. Every one of these moves is a brick in the wall of independence, a wall that protects sovereignty against the storms of global politics. Independence is also leverage. The more self-reliant you are, the stronger your negotiating position becomes. When you don't depend on someone else's approval, you cannot be blackmailed. When you don't need to beg for access, you negotiate from strength. India's decision to keep buying Russian oil wasn't rebellion, it was leverage. It showed that they had enough economic weight, enough alternative systems, enough self-confidence to act in their own interest without fear. And in that moment, it was clear that independence is not just survival, it is power in its purest form. Other nations are watching closely. They see that those who depend too heavily on one system or one partner live in fear. They see that the nations with independence are free to choose, free to pivot, free to prioritize their own people above outside demands. And that is why independence has become the new global currency. It cannot be printed like money. It cannot be manufactured overnight. It is earned through discipline, built through resilience, and defended through courage. It is the one thing no sanction, no tariff, no threat can erase. And in this new age of shifting power, the countries that hold it will lead the future. In the world of power, noise has always been mistaken for strength. Threats shouted across podiums, sanctions announced with drama. Military parades designed to intimidate, these have been the symbols of dominance for generations. But in reality, true power has never been about who can shout the loudest. It has always been about who can act with quiet certainty and deliver results that no one can ignore. Quiet action speaks louder than loud threats because results cannot be argued with. You can debate words, you can dismiss speeches, but you cannot deny a road that has been built, a rocket that has been launched, an economy that has been lifted. Noise fades quickly, results remain. This is where India has changed the global narrative. While America has been busy making threats and issuing warnings, India has been busy building. They didn't waste time responding to every criticism or every headline. They didn't waste energy trying to convince the world with long speeches about morality or justice. They simply acted. When the West shouted about sanctions, India quietly signed energy deals that ensured stability for their people. When others doubted their technological capacity, India quietly launched a spacecraft to the moon and placed their name in history. When critics tried to box them in as a follower rather than a leader, India quietly developed digital platforms that now serve hundreds of millions of citizens and stand as models for the rest of the world. The silence of these actions is louder than any threat because the proof lies in the achievement itself. The strength of quiet action lies in its focus. Loud threats are meant to scare, to distract, to force compliance through fear. But quiet action is rooted in discipline. It is not about reacting. It is about building brick by brick until the results speak for themselves. India did not fight back with words when tariffs were raised. They did not retaliate with noise when pressure was applied. Instead, they doubled down on their own path, investing in infrastructure, energy security, technology, and self-reliance. And the more they acted, the more the threats around them looked hollow. Because a threat only works if the other side fears losing something. India showed that they had built enough resilience, enough independence, that no threat could derail their mission. That is why quiet action is so powerful. It transforms threats into background noise. And there's another truth hidden in this. Loud threats are about control. But quiet action is about mastery. When a nation acts without needing approval, it proves it has mastered its own path. When it builds without boasting, it shows it has confidence. When it delivers results without seeking validation, it demonstrates maturity. That kind of mastery unnerves the old powers, because it cannot be controlled. You cannot threaten someone who doesn't depend on you. You cannot intimidate someone who doesn't need your approval. And you cannot silence someone whose work is visible in front of the entire world. Look at how the world perceives India today. It is not the speeches or the declarations that define their image. It is the actions. It is the factories, the highways, the growing economy, the satellites, the military strength, the digital revolution. These are not promises, these are realities, and they are all being done with quiet confidence, rather than loud confrontation. That is why India's silence is so deafening. They don't need to shout. They don't need to prove themselves with empty words. They simply move forward steadily, relentlessly, and let their progress do the talking. And when progress speaks, the world has no choice but to listen. Respect in today's world is not commanded by orders. It is earned by results. For decades, the global system ran on a simple formula: one nation dictated, and the rest complied. Compliance was mistaken for respect, obedience was confused with loyalty, and silence was seen as partnership. But all of that was built on fear, not admiration. True respect cannot be demanded with sanctions, tariffs, or military threats. True respect comes when a nation delivers for its people, when it proves through action that it can stand on its own, when its success becomes undeniable even to its critics. The world doesn't admire noise, it admires performance. It doesn't respect commands, it respects results.
India is living proof of this shift. When they refused to bow to Washington's pressure over Russian oil, it wasn't just a political decision, it was a test of dignity. Critics expected India to crumble under threats, to retreat when confronted, to play the role of the junior partner in a one-sided relationship. But instead, India held its ground, not through defiance, not through reckless rebellion, but through quiet, calculated action. They kept buying what their people needed, they kept paying in ways that bypassed control, and they kept building their economy even under criticism. That resilience earned respect, not just from their own citizens, but from nations around the globe, who saw in India an example of what leadership truly means.
Because the truth is simple. People follow those who deliver. Nations admire those who protect their citizens above foreign demands. The loudest speeches don't inspire confidence, feeding your people does. Threats don't build respect. Lifting millions out of poverty does. Sanctions don't create admiration. Rockets to the moon do. Every time India focuses on outcomes instead of arguments, they gain more credibility on the world stage. Their growing economy, their space program, their digital revolution, their defense capabilities, all of these are markers of results that speak louder than any slogan. And in the end, that is what the world listens to.
This is why the old idea of with us or against us no longer works. That thinking belonged to an era when nations had no choice but to obey. But today, performance creates alliances. Nations want partners who can deliver, not partners who can just obey orders. They respect a country that has proven itself capable of standing alone, because only those who can stand alone can truly be trusted as equals. India's rise is respected not because it talks about independence, but because it practices it. It chooses energy deals that serve its people. It builds systems that don't rely on outsiders. It invests in infrastructure and technology that increase its resilience. That consistency, that commitment to results, is why the world is paying attention.
And respect built on results is far more powerful than respect demanded by fear. Fear fades the moment a stronger player appears. Fear collapses when the threats stop working. But respect rooted in results only grows. Because success is visible, measurable, undeniable. You cannot argue against a satellite orbiting Earth. You cannot dismiss a digital economy serving 1 billion people. You cannot ignore factories producing goods, armies protecting borders, or millions of citizens rising into the middle class. These are not promises. These are results, and results are what the world respects. India's path shows something deeper as well. Respect built on results is lasting because it is not dependent on anyone else's approval. It doesn't vanish when alliances shift or when global narratives change. It remains because it is anchored in reality. Nations that demand respect through orders are already losing it. Nations that earn it through results are shaping the future. And that is the difference the world is beginning to recognize every time India takes another step forward. The future does not belong to those who wait for permission. It belongs to those bold enough to carve their own path. For centuries, the global order was designed like a pyramid. At the top sat the powers that dictated terms, and at the bottom were the nations expected to follow. The idea was simple: choose a side, obey the rules, and you might receive some benefits in return. But that system is crumbling, and in its place emerges a new reality where nations can no longer be boxed into someone else's blueprint. The future belongs to those who refuse to be told who they must ally with, who they must trade with, or how they must act. It belongs to nations who have the vision to put their own people first, and the courage to say, "We're on our own team." India has demonstrated this truth with remarkable clarity. While others try to force the world back into rigid alliances of us versus them, India has chosen flexibility over conformity. They signed military deals with Washington, while securing energy deals with Moscow. They work with Western tech giants while building a domestic tech ecosystem that stands on its own. They sit at the table with China when it makes sense, while strengthening bonds with Europe, the Middle East, and the global South. To the old powers, this looks confusing, even disloyal, because they are trapped in outdated thinking, where loyalty meant blind obedience. But India is proving something revolutionary. Loyalty to foreign powers is not leadership. Loyalty to your own people is. And this is exactly why the future belongs to such nations. When you rely on old empires to guide your every step, you remain stuck in their shadow. But when you choose your own direction, when you decide to prioritize your own citizens, your own economy, your own sovereignty, you set yourself free. That freedom is frightening to those who built their influence on control, because it cannot be manipulated. A nation that can say yes or no on its own terms is ungovernable by outsiders. That is why India's rise is not just about economic numbers or technological breakthroughs. It is about the principle of choice. The ability to choose is the ultimate form of power in this new world. Choice is leverage. Choice is security. Choice is freedom. Nations that have it can never be cornered, because they always have another option. This is why India's approach resonates globally. It is not about confrontation. It is not about replacing one superpower with another. It is about creating a balance where no single country holds absolute control over anyone else. This balance doesn't come from speeches. It comes from the ability to say no, the ability to pivot, the ability to negotiate from strength instead of fear. That is why India's voice carries weight, not because it shouts the loudest, but because it can stand alone if it must. Its future also belongs to nations that think generationally instead of politically. Too often, leaders act for applause in the moment, sacrificing the long-term health of their nations for short-term approval. But nations like India are playing the long game. They are investing in infrastructure that will last decades, in education that will transform generations, in technology that will shape the next century. They are not reacting emotionally to threats. They are calculating carefully, building patiently, and moving steadily. This patience, this focus, is why they are positioning themselves not just to survive in the new multipolar world, but to lead it. And that is the lesson for every rising nation. The future doesn't ask who you followed, it asks what you built. It doesn't ask how loudly you obeyed, it asks how strongly you stood on your own. It doesn't ask who gave you permission. It asks if you had the courage to give yourself permission. The nations that will define the next era are the ones that can act independently, think boldly, and stand firmly in the face of pressure. And India has shown the blueprint of how it is done.